We stand today at the threshold of a great event, both in the life of the United Nations and in the life of mankind. This Universal Declaration of Human Rights may well become the international Magna Carta of all men everywhere.
The Economic and Social Council created a Commission on Human Rights on the 16th of February 1946.
Notre déclaration se présente comme la plus vigoureuse, la plus nécessaire des protestations de l'humanité contre les atrocités et les oppressions.
I'm Harrison Ford. I live in the United States, but I'm a citizen of the world as well. Here at the United Nations 50 years ago, a dedicated group of men and women created an unprecedented document, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's a statement of principles and beliefs that summons each of us to a higher standard. It's not always prevented inhumanity or abuse, but it's given us a set of human rights norms that apply to everyone, everywhere.
Nazi Germany in the 1930s. Racial purity is the driving force of a regime that seeks to create a master race of fair-skinned, blue-eyed men, women, and children. Those who do not meet the criteria for pure blood are marked for extinction, their lives deemed worthless. The Third Reich's zeal for genetic superiority was the extreme interpretation of human engineering theories prevalent at the time. In some countries, including the United States, immigration laws were passed to keep out the genetically undesirable. But no one had ever seen anything like the carnage of the Third Reich. Jews, gypsies, communists, homosexuals, alcoholics were shipped to the death camps. At first, outside observers felt powerless to prevent the atrocities inside Hitler's Germany. In later years, what they had witnessed would forge their determination to make human rights a concern that transcends all borders.
But what I saw, which stands out most clearly in my memory, and I think brought me to the United Nations, was the SS taking an old Jewish man, Orthodox Jew, and putting him in a dog cart and whipping him through the streets of Frankfurt, laughing.
One of the UN's earliest advocates of human rights was Lebanese scholar Charles Malik. His son recalls how his father, as a young man studying philosophy in Germany, was a victim of Nazi brutality.
My father, being from the Middle East, had Semitic features and did not at all fit the prevailing pattern of what was accepted at the time. He was walking on the street in Freiburg as a student there. A military person, without a word, turned around and gave him a very severe kick in the leg.
As the horrors of the Third Reich intensified, the world stood helplessly by. Germany withdrew from the League of Nations. They would have no outside interference. Ultimately, this contempt kindled a global awareness that in the future, the world would need a forceful legal structure to stop assaults on human dignity. French jurist René Cassin was determined that the Nazi terror must never happen again. The son of a Jewish wine merchant, during World War I, he had been seriously injured. He had campaigned for the rights of veterans and the widows and orphans of war, always with an eye to the international picture.
C'est en 1933, quand la carence.
It was in 1933, when the failures of the League of Nations and the human will allowed Hitler to rise to power and to prosper, may I say, without anyone interfering. It was at that moment that we felt that the international world had to get involved in protecting human rights.
S'occupa de la protection des droits de l'homme.
With the opening salvos of World War II in 1939, many realized that any new international organization that replaced the old League of Nations must not just keep the peace between sovereign countries, but protect individual lives and liberties as well. As war raged in Europe, in his 1941 State of the Union address, President Franklin Roosevelt outlined his vision for a future world, the famous 4 freedoms.
First is freedom of speech and expression everywhere in the world. The second is freedom of every person to worship God in his own way everywhere in the world. The third, freedom from want. The fourth is freedom from fear, which translated into world terms means a worldwide reduction of armaments everywhere in the world.
President Roosevelt's aspirations were more hope than reality, coming as they did as the United States prepared for war. There was much to be done to meet the demands for guns and ammunition, so much that a law was passed to ban discrimination against women and African Americans in all war production industries. A young civil servant, Edward Lawson, made sure African Americans were employed on an equal basis. Later, he would champion human rights on a global scale as an assistant to Eleanor Roosevelt at the United Nations. April 1945, World War II was ending. In Europe, the German army collapsed, and Adolf Hitler died by his own hand. One of the most profane nightmares in the history of the world was over. The sudden death of United States President Franklin Delano Roosevelt shocked the world. Soon thereafter, in San Francisco, California, representatives from all over the world arrived to bring one of his dreams to life. Over the next 2 months, delegates would debate, ponder, and compromise to create the charter of a new international organization, the United Nations. The delegates were made aware of the true extent of Hitler's Holocaust as the concentration camps were liberated. Newsreels brought horrifying pictures to San Francisco. In liberated Paris, a young Frenchman, Stéphane Hissel, who had narrowly escaped death in the camps, was now a junior diplomat.
Les camps nazis, c'était vraiment la négation de la...
The Nazi camps were truly a negation of man's dignity. We were treated as objects, not even as beasts, but as objects. That was intolerable, and we said it must never happen again. The experience of the camps revealed to me the need to do my utmost so that the dignity of human beings could be retrieved and protected.
The demand for the dignity of everyone, everywhere, evolved into a simple yet eloquent two-word phrase: human rights. But in 1945, as the San Francisco Conference was creating the United Nations Charter, there was a danger that the human rights of individuals might take a back seat to a more immediate crisis between nations. Luckily, human rights had powerful advocates.
A number of religious groups, as well as civic groups, were interested in promoting the United Nations and interested particularly in promoting human rights.
It is now my duty, my honor and my privilege in the chair to call for a vote on the approval of the Charter of the United Nations.
June 26, 1945, the San Francisco delegates approved the United Nations Charter. Human rights were mentioned 7 times. Not only that, the Charter established a Commission on Human Rights, a major step ensuring that the protection of individual liberties would be crucial in the post-war world. But on a daily basis, harsh political reality pitted the rights of nations against the rights of individuals, a cold fact with which the UN has coped from the beginning. As the fledgling organization entered 1946, every part of the planet posed problems. In South Africa, echoes of the recent Nazi past resounded in the name of apartheid, as blacks and Indians were harassed, denied voting and other rights. In India, still under British rule, millions supported the Congress movement's call for independence. One of its leaders was the diminutive legislator Hansa Mehta, who would bring her passion and intellect to the human rights work of the UN. Even the major powers that publicly embraced human rights had trouble on their home fronts. Joseph Stalin ruled the Soviet Union with an iron fist. By the millions, suspected enemies died or disappeared.
It was the party, the Communist Party, that determined what kind of expression would be made in the media, what kind of organizations would be had, what kind of trade unions would be permitted.
In the United States, home of the 4 freedoms, segregation was still a brutal reality.
Particularly in the South, there were, in the immediate post-war period, there were a number of lynchings which evoked considerable opposition.
A sculpture in front of the United Nations is a symbol of the broken world of 1946, a world crying out for basic human rights.
This must have been something like the way the world looked to the founding fathers and mothers of the Universal Declaration after World War II, with this beautiful golden sphere, all broken perhaps because it's innately flawed, but broken maybe in the way that an egg has to break in order for something new to emerge.
Eleanor Roosevelt, widow of the popular American president, was chosen to head the United Nations Human Rights Commission. She already had achieved worldwide fame as a compassionate defender of the needy and downtrodden everywhere. It is a testament to her international reputation that at a time when virtually no women held any positions of authority in the United Nations, she was appointed to chair the group that would undertake the drafting of the world's first Universal Declaration of Human Rights. 1947, Lake Success, not far from New York City. After months of intense preparation, the full Commission on Human Rights, with representatives of 18 nations, gathered for the first time. Stefan Hissel, now a junior UN officer, saw in the meeting place an ironic metaphor of swords beaten into plowshares.
Lake Success est une usine souterraine dans laquelle pendant la guerre...
Lake Success, the Sperry plant, was an underground factory. During the war, spare parts for airplanes were made there. What I found amusing was that my concentration camp in Germany, where I spent several months in the Harz Mountains, well, that was also an underground plant that produced spare parts for Junkers 53 planes. So I've gone from war to peace, and the sites were always underground factories.
Donc je passe de la guerre à la paix, et les locaux sont toujours des usines souterraines.
Eleanor Roosevelt introduces the delegates to the newsreel cameras. They are an extraordinary collection of philosophers, theorists, and diplomats.
For more than 10 minutes. I will begin on my right with the delegate from France, Professor René Cassin.
He took a leading part in the drafting. In fact, he saw himself as the principal drafter of the Declaration.
Next, the delegate from Chile, Honorable Monsieur Santa Cruz.
A good diplomat and also a very energetic person.
The delegate from China, who is also vice chairman of the committee, Dr. P.C. Chang.
He was always a rather calming influence. He would inject some apt philosophical comment if things were getting rather hot.
Our Assistant Secretary General, Monsieur Laugier.
J'ai la chance de tomber sur un patron.
I was lucky to have a chief, Henri Laugier, who was a fighter for democracy and internationalism. It was wonderful to work for him.
On my left, the committee secretary, Dr. Humphrey.
John Humphrey était pour nous un exemple merveilleux.
John Humphrey was for us an exemplary and conscientious worker. He had lost an arm, but he had the allure of a stately man. He was tall, he was handsome, and his empty sleeve always impressed the people around him.
The rapporteur of the committee and the delegate from Lebanon, Dr. Malik.
He was not easily pushed around, and he maintained his views as strongly as he could.
The delegate from the USSR, Professor Vladimir Koretsky. The delegate from the United Kingdom, Mr. Jeffrey Wilson.
These were the kind of people who would not let evil triumph. They had seen the worst, and they were determined to do their best to see that these sorts of things would not happen again.
As chair of the Human Rights Commission, Mrs. Roosevelt carried out her duties with a fierce commitment.
When the committee, the third committee as it was then, the General Assembly, dealt with these things, and they were supposed to meet at 10 o'clock in the morning, she would be the only delegate there at 10 o'clock. She occasionally took her meals in the cafeteria instead of, as most senior delegates did, elsewhere. All of this made her a personality for the people around.
Southeast Asia. A representative for the UN Human Rights Program, Thomas Hammerberg, is on a mission to Koh Kong, a remote border town on the coast of Cambodia. He will attempt to free 2 young women who for several weeks have been illegally detained. In the early days of the United Nations, such an intervention might have been attacked as violating national sovereignty. But today, human rights abuses are everyone's business, regardless of borders. At a grassroots level like this, case by case, bit by bit, people can be helped. First stop, the local police chief's office.
I'm very grateful to you that you received me today. I represent the Secretary General when it comes to human rights here in Cambodia, which means that I make frequent visits to Cambodia and travel in the provinces to try to learn and understand about the situation. I'm thinking about one particular case recently where 2 women was detained by the military and detained in the military barracks here, which seems to me to be completely illegal, and that this should be something for the police.
The police send Hammerberg to the military. At the barracks, one of the 2 women is brought to the negotiating table.
If you go and ask people to come here to have a talk with them, that must be seen as an arrest. And the question is, has a military institution of this kind the right, according to Cambodian law, to make arrests? As I read the Cambodian constitution, it does not allow military to conduct arrests.
We just made a report to the region's headquarters, but we did not report to the military prosecutor because we did not commit the arrest or detention. We just invited them here.
But the young woman was held against her will.
I was locked up in a room. When they wanted to feed me, they had to open a hole in the door. They gave me my bowl of food through that hole.
The 2 women testify to sexual abuse at the hands of their jailers. Thanks to the moral authority of the UN, and backed by international outrage, Hammerberg obtains their freedom.
When people are oppressed, it's important for them that there is a possibility for outsiders to speak for them. That's the whole idea about international human rights norms.
In 1947, the norms we now hold dear were still a source of fierce debate, as the future UN Secretariat was being erected on the site of an abandoned New York City slaughterhouse. Legal experts and diplomats continued to hammer out the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. A law professor from Canada, John Humphrey, was in charge of gathering all the existing human rights documents he could lay his hands on. His staff solicited ideas from the world's great thinkers, among them Mahatma Gandhi, father of passive resistance, the British man of letters H.G. Wells, and Italian philosopher Benedetto Croce.
Humphrey did a marvelous job of assembling and systematizing a vast quantity of material. But it was Cassin who was able to turn that vast quantity of material into a coherent, organic document with an architecture, with themes, principles, interlocking parts. So each one, in a sense, was an author. Each one could say, in a sense, I was the author, but they were authors together with many other people. All the people from all over the world who had contributed to the source documents.
Edward Lawson was one of the dedicated many who gave the draft declaration substance. He had a sense of justice well honed from his work demanding equal employment opportunities in the U.S. war effort. Working with him was a young woman from the British Foreign Office, Molly Bruce.
He was recruited from the, I think it was the Commission on Fair Labor Practices of New York. And of course he was concerned with discrimination particularly. We all were working much behind the scenes to get things into the Declaration. He was very much part of the initial drafting of the working paper on the Declaration.
From this mosaic of documents, suggestions, and demands, René Cassin collected the best into a text he wrote for the drafting committee in pen and ink. He worked his way through his blueprint, adding and correcting, word by carefully chosen word.
We would try to find wording that all sides would accept. And it was a challenge, and it was quite interesting to play with that. Obviously, for some of the key issues, you knew that it had to be fought out between East and West.
Starting with the opening words of the draft declaration's preamble, every syllable underwent relentless scrutiny. The first article, inspired by the American Declaration of Independence, stated that all men are created equal. Mrs. Hansa Mehta of India strongly objected. She felt that a declaration saying all men would be taken too literally. What's more, the Soviet Union objected to the religious implications of the verb created. In the end, the article was amended to read, all human beings are born free and equal.
Naturally, each of them had their own ideas. Cassin tried to emphasize such and such a term which seemed important to him. Mrs. Roosevelt, who had a lot of authority, insisted on a certain formulation, and Humphrey tried to bring them all to an agreement.
During the endless debates, political and civil rights were easily accepted, but economic, social, and cultural rights caused a deep rift.
In fact, there was very broad consensus in the process over the idea of social and economic rights in the Declaration. Mrs. Roosevelt, after all, brought into the proceedings Roosevelt's 4 freedoms, including the freedom from want. So the fight was not over the rights as such. It really was between the Soviets, who said that the rights were being treated in the Universal Declaration as inferior somehow to the political and civil rights, and another group whose spokesman was mainly England, who said that these rights are so different from political and civil rights that they ought to be in a separate document.
On this spring day in Paris, the split between civil liberties and economic and social rights is highlighted when a group of jobless hit the streets to redress a grievance. Exercising their civil liberties, they demonstrate to demand reduced transit fares for the unemployed. They believe that affordable transportation is their economic and social right, especially in hard times.
I lost my job last August. Since then, I've been unemployed.
So since money is the only thing they understand, we'll just have to go and block the trains.
Évitez de mettre les deux pieds entre les rails. On touche 2005 par mois. On n'a pas payé. On n'a pas payé.
For 2.5 years now, I've lived on the edges of society. I consider myself as someone who has lost everything. And after I worked for my country for 40 years, it's a scandal.
C'est scandaleux.
The demonstrators are escorted off the tracks of the Gare Saint-Lazare with the promise of talks about reduced fares for the unemployed. What divides political and civil rights from economic and social ones remains as complex and profound as in the late 40s when the Universal Declaration was being drafted.
When you have civil rights, for example, the freedom to write or to think, or the right to be a Muslim, Jew, or Christian, well, that doesn't cost the state anything. Whereas the right to work, the right to health, the right to an education, all that costs a lot. That's the difference. The state becomes a debtor. The state has to pay a lot of money so that I can exercise these rights.
In the fall of 1948, the UN General Assembly convened in Paris. Human rights, high on its agenda. The keys to the Palais de Chaillot were presented to Secretary General Trygve Lie. He would host the UN meeting there. By now, the proposed Declaration of Human Rights had been revised again and again. Here it would face its final hurdle, debate and vote before the full General Assembly.
Let this third regular session of the General Assembly approve by an overwhelming majority the Declaration of Human Rights as a standard of conduct for all.
The principles that had guided all those who had toiled for years on the Declaration offered something for everyone. In this spirit, the document had been called an international declaration. Bernice Cassin suggested that it be dubbed a universal declaration, embracing all of humanity.
What makes for the depth, the solidity, and scope of the Declaration in relation to humanity is the fact that it expresses the aspirations of all human beings, not in one respect only, but in terms of all their faculties and their rights.
The founders of the Universal Declaration believed that the right question is not whether it is an idea from such or such a country, but rather, is it a good idea? And is it a universal idea? Is it a universalizable idea? Every single one of the important actors in framing the Universal Declaration expected that these very general rights would take different forms of expression in different cultures. They had universality in mind, but they did not have homogeneity in mind.
The vision of universality, so passionately debated in Paris 5 decades ago, now resonates in places as far away as a rural community in Uganda. Here, school children learn of their rights as human beings in their own tongue, the language of Luganda.
We have in Uganda, I think, a very good example of how African societies can come together and overcome adversity. But I would emphasize that the image and the values that we need to emphasize is the courage and the dignity of women, of children, of old men on the ground.
The aged, as well as the young, respond to the clarion call of human rights. After years of merciless repression, they are eager at last to speak their minds.
During the previous regimes, you could not tell whether you would be alive tomorrow. Other people had control over your life. Somebody might tell you that you were going to die tomorrow, and that would be it. We would have preferred if somebody was sick for a long time and then died from natural causes. This is the right to life we would have wanted to have.
Human rights become even more of a reality now that villagers have the opportunity to lodge complaints with the Human Rights Commission of Uganda. The lawyer who helps them adheres to the same principles first articulated by the founders of the UN Declaration.
Okay, first, the rights which were set out in the Universal Declaration are very important. They are universal. They're for everybody. Whether you're from China or India or Africa or America, they're applicable.
As Eleanor Roosevelt noted years ago, human rights begin on the smallest scale, at home. But it's only in recent years that international action has been brought to bear at this level. Now, global activities are organized to end violence that targets women, such as genital mutilation, forced prostitution, or wartime rape.
The whole issue of domestic violence was not even mentioned in the 40s and the 50s. It was considered a taboo issue, something you could not mention because you might be attacking the sanctity of the family. Thanks to the Universal Declaration and its interpretation, now there are in every country that I have visited some program on violence against women and prevention of domestic violence in the home.
Paris, December 1948. The back-and-forth struggle over the Declaration text was an early display of the new Cold War tensions between East and West. Each side examined some of the key articles through a strict ideological lens.
There are two kinds of rights, civil and political rights. Those everyone agreed on. Although the Soviets found them rather backward, the West, the United States in particular, was all for civil and political rights, but much less in favor of social, economic, and cultural rights. René Cassin insisted that the first and second sets of rights could not be divided, and that the social, economic, and cultural rights had to be included in the Universal Declaration.
As African women displaced by war know too well, freedom from want begins with a simple bowl of gruel. Yet until 1948, such bare necessities were not considered a human right. The Declaration's Article 22 introduced social security as a fundamental freedom for the individual. Despite much opposition, René Cassin held firm and made certain it became a part of the final draft.
All his life, he was proud that he had formulated the famous lead article, number 22, in which he introduced the concept that it is quite useless to have freedom and to vote if you're not strong enough to walk, if you have nothing to eat, and if you live in extreme misery.
Cold War fear and aggression colored the efforts of the fledgling United Nations. Many wondered if human rights could survive the emerging struggle between East and West.
Donc c'était une phase où l'écart entre l'Est.
At that time, the gap between East and West was widening. We could sense that if we gave in to these developments, it would be difficult to get something as ambitious as the Universal Declaration adopted.
In retrospect, all of the major participants said that if the process had been drawn out much further, that the window of opportunity would have closed. The Cold War was becoming more intense. Fighting had broken out in Greece and Korea. If it weren't adopted by December of 1948, most observers thought it wouldn't have been adopted.
The creators of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights could not have predicted the grim terror of the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia. But the rules of conduct they designed were intended to prevail, even when human freedoms were most grievously violated. Tourists and survivors visit a mass grave, skeletal remains from the killing fields. Chum Rath has returned from his new home in the United States.
I was born in Cambodia, and then the communists took over, then they sent me to the farm too, and they put me to work. And, you know, I was a part of this genocide, you know. I was like 6 years old, and all I remember is this bad thing. And I was lucky to be alive, because I was almost died a couple of times, starvation, and just one of the lucky to survive it.
At Tuol Sang, a former extermination center, thousands of men and women were stripped of all rights and murdered in the name of an ideology. Human freedoms need human champions who will fight and deny the forces of darkness. On a visit to Cambodia, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Mary Robinson, confronts that nation's terrible past.
These were not foreigners killing Khmers. This was not a racial conflict or ethnic conflict, religious conflict. These were Cambodians killing Cambodians on a large scale.
And yes, on the photo you can see the red spot there. This is the top of the head of the victims.
Man is capable of terrible inhumanity, and we have within ourselves capacities for great hatred, capacities for also very generous impulses and loving emotions, and it's important that we fight against and, as an international community, eliminate the hatred that this place represents, the humiliating, degrading torture that went on here.
The fact that the United Nations or any other international body did not react to the mass killings in this country, in Cambodia, during those 3.5 years when 1.7 million people, about 20% of the population, were killed, either executed or through diseases and difficulties caused by the policy of the government. I think it's one of the most shameful aspects of failures that we are responsible for.
In 1994, a paroxysm of horror sweeps Rwanda. One ethnic community turns against the other in a vicious genocidal war. In 3 months, 100,000 are slaughtered. Once again, respect for human rights is crushed, and with it comes the brutal victimizing of women.
What I found in Rwanda, for example, really boggled my mind, and the nature and extent of the kind of violence that can be perpetrated against women. Not only against all members of that community it was perpetrated, but against women it seemed particularly vicious. And also violence of women against women, which is something I've never seen or heard of anywhere else.
4 years after the genocide, the UN Secretary General arrives in Rwanda on a mission of healing. What happened there shows that human rights may be violated, but it does not destroy their validity. The 10 Commandments are broken daily, but we recognize them as rules by which we should live.
The international community could not muster the resources or the will to come to the aid of the Rwandese people as quickly as we would have. And as the General Dallaire said, at the critical time, if he had had 5,000 soldiers, one reinforced brigade, he could have made a lot of difference.
Key to the future of human rights is the establishment of enforcement mechanisms that can pinpoint and punish transgressors.
Intervention can begin with just an individual shouting, "This is enough. I can't take this. I cannot see this happen to another human being." And we've seen situations where the public has reacted, and the governments have realized that if they didn't move, they would have faced a public relations outrage. And they have moved, they have reacted, but they banded together to put pressure on a dictator who may be suppressing his own people, and in some cases say, let's move and do something about it. So we all have responsibilities as individuals, as groups, and as governments, and after all, the governments are the peoples.
In the 50 years since the Universal Declaration was forged, much has been done to bring people under the protective umbrella of human rights. The struggles that put an end to colonialism have changed the map of the world. When Namibia, one of the last colonial holdouts, gained its independence, its citizens rejoiced. In South Africa, Nelson Mandela, a beacon of perseverance and defiance, was freed after decades of solitary confinement. It was the beginning of the end for apartheid.
Amandla! Amandla! In Africa!
I think we have had remarkable achievements in the area of human rights. We don't have a perfect record, but we can be proud of what we have achieved. The whole struggle for decolonization was a struggle for human rights. The struggle of civil rights, the women's movement, is all about human rights. The rights of children, which UNICEF has given us, is all about rights. And when you look around you, and in fact sometimes when I look back and consider what happened during the last World War, the Second World War, I ask myself, what would the world have done if they had the convention? Would it have inspired many more people to speak up? Would it have given people a yardstick and a standard by which to act and to judge the behavior of others?
Paris, 1948. The chairman of the committee debating the final declaration text was the redoubtable Charles Malik.
In the fall of 1948, over a number of meetings presided by Charles Malik in Paris, where the final version of the Universal Declaration was hammered out, he stuck very rigidly to the stopwatch rule, the 3-minute rule for any speaker.
Their remarks limited by Charles Mallock's strictly enforced stopwatch, the committee finished shaping the articles and sent the declaration to the General Assembly for the final vote.
Finalement, le 10 décembre, la date fatidique était là.
At last, the 10th of December, the fatal day, and for all of us in the Secretariat who worked in this area, it was a very moving moment because we knew that most of the people were for it, but we wondered if there'd be a vote against. Maybe Saudi Arabia would vote against it, and would the Soviet Union vote for it or abstain?
Well, now I put the proposal to adopt as a whole the draft Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which paragraph by paragraph, article by article, has been adopted.
The delegates were there in front of us, and we were in the back, we who worked in the Secretariat. We tried to see who was voting and how, so it was also for me personally a very powerful moment.
In favour of adoption, 48. Against adoption, none. Abstentions, 8. So that we reach the stage, gentlemen, in which by an enormous vote and without any direct opposition, this Assembly has adopted this very important declaration. I do congratulate those who worked so zealously to achieve this result and for so long, particularly Mrs. Roosevelt, the delegate of the United States.
With the passage of the Declaration, a brief moment to celebrate and congratulate, mindful that although much hard work remained, this new Human Rights Declaration was an important contribution to the world.
It was a great success, and this success continues to this day. This declaration, this text that was created in the course of just a few years, today it has a very powerful symbolic value. No government today dares to say that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is none of their business.
It has meant hope, it has meant power for change, but also it has meant frustration, because the more I see the promise, the more I see the difficulties of realizing that promise. Sometimes I feel hope, sometimes I feel despair, ups and downs, like with all human activities. But I would say that it has transformed my life personally. I am not the person I would have been without the Universal Declaration.
Muy bien, muy bien.
Je pense que ça continue de représenter
I think that it continues to represent the strongest and greatest aspiration of men and women all over the world. But I have to say that 50 years after the Universal Declaration, very many problems still need to be resolved, both in the industrialized, developed countries as well as in the developing countries.
dans les pays sous-développés.